Picture this, a sold-out crowd gathered on a Tuesday night in Kelowna, all here for a debate about something that's supposedly disappearing, or evolving, or collapsing, depending on who you ask. I'm Nathan Skalski, and this is UBC Okanagan Debates. On October 21st, 2025, at the Kelowna Community Theatre, UBC Okanagan held its sixth debate in its signature series. The question on the table is masculinity in crisis. It's not a theoretical question. Across Canada, 44% of men die before the age 75 from preventable causes. Boys are falling behind in schools and universities. Suicide rates, opioid deaths, radicalization. The statistics paint a grim picture. But the statistics also tell competing stories. On one side of our stage is Dr. John Oliffe, founder of UBC's Men's Health Research Program, and Jonathan Kay, editor and podcaster with Quillette. Their position is that men are experiencing systemic failure across health, education, and social function. This isn't evolution, it's crisis. On the other side is Dr. Fung Wan, a professor at UBC Okanagan studying leadership and psychology, and Dr. Luc Cousineau from Dalhousie University, co-director of research at the Canadian Institute for Far-Right Studies. Their argument is that what we're witnessing isn't dissolution, it's adaptation. The concept of masculinity is doing exactly what it has always done, evolving. As moderator, my role was to direct the flow of conversation, ensuring each side could fully articulate their position while maintaining the respectful and civil dialogue that defines these debates. The conversation ranged from status anxiety and social media's relentless comparisons to whether masculinity has ever been singular or stable, to how men and boys respond differently to distress. There were moments of heated disagreement and unexpected common ground. We designed UBC Okanagan Debates to model civil discourse in a polarized world, bringing together renowned experts to discuss disputed and timely topics. Tonight's debate was hosted by Dr. Lesley Cormack, Principal and Deputy Vice Chancellor at UBC Okanagan. Here's what happened.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. As UBC marks its 20th anniversary here at the Okanagan, I'm grateful to the Okanagan Nation for having welcomed us and worked with us in partnership. My name is Lesley Cormack. I'm the principal of UBC Okanagan, and I really do want to thank you for joining us this evening, and welcome to the sixth installment of the UBC Okanagan Debate Series. It's hard to believe it's 6 times that we've done this, and every time is better than the last, so I definitely tell you this is going to be a great event. If you haven't been to one of these debates before, I do want to tell you that our mission is to champion civil discourse by tackling topics that often divide us. How do we talk about things that we disagree? This is the chance to see how that works. For some, tonight's topic, masculinity in crisis, may be divisive. While for others, having a debate at all seems controversial in itself. Some may ask, UBC is committed to equity and inclusion, so why have a debate about men's issues? Or with the attack taking place on women's rights, why spend time debating a so-called masculinity crisis? For me, the answer is because all of this is related. These are two sides of the same coin, that inclusion and equity involves both men and women, that we need to find a way that we work together, not at odds. Tonight's debate is a chance to look at how young men are finding their way in uncertain times, and to consider whether we're giving them the support they need to do that, with dignity, empathy, and resilience. And if we're not, then it's not just a men's issue, it's a societal issue. As a lifelong feminist and as the mother of 2 young men, this debate is personal for me too. And I think it's one that can help us think about our collective future together in a new way. I'm delighted that UBC not only takes civil discourse seriously, but also men's health. And you'll get to hear from one of our leading experts in this area tonight. Our Forward for UBC campaign is one of the ways that our university is striving to be a change maker. One of our campaign pillars is advancing healthy lives, with the goal of driving the research and innovation that leads to better health outcomes, including new approaches to mental health and wellness. Our donors and alumni are catalysts to make that happen. By opening up this important conversation about masculinity tonight, we're taking another bold step, I believe, towards greater understanding, solutions, and an equitable healthcare system for all. With that, I want to thank everyone for being with us this evening, and I really hope that you enjoy tonight's debates.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the UBC Okanagan debates. So, we are going to start now with opening statements. I'll first call on Dr. John Oliffe for his 3-minute opening statement. John will present the case that masculinity is in crisis.
Let me begin by saying all I've got is 3 minutes and the truth. And the truth is an unfortunate one, it's an uncomfortable one, that yes, masculinity is indeed in crisis. 44% of the men in Canada will die prematurely before the age of 75 from completely preventable and delayable death causes. In order, it's cancers, cardiovascular disease, unintentional accidents, including overdose and suicide, that are robbing us of those years of life. Really important because a lot of times what we do is we tend to talk about men's behaviours as being implicated as an explanatory note for that. When we talk about men's self-reliance, their strength and their stoicism. And sure, that does delay some help seeking. It does occur, and certainly defending one's masculinity is part of the problem. But it just seems that what we've gotten into most recently nowadays is these masculine norms, even though they're known really well, what we tend to be doing is saying that it's cause-effect, it's victim blaming, and it's resulted in this manosphere-based monolithic masculinity that's killing men, oftentimes at their own hands. We have basically conceded masculinity as a deficit-ridden social determinant of health in this country, amid foreclosing on the structural determinants of health with an inexplicable waiver for the lack of gender-responsive services. 4 out of 5 suicides in Canada are male. 60% of the men who die by suicide will have accessed professional healthcare services in the 12 months before their death. In terms of suicidality, the 3 biggest factors involved in men are alcohol and other substance use, relationship breakdowns, and being single, and depression. And the taxes from the sale of alcohol and now cannabis won't begin to undo those harms. A man who separates is 2.8 times more likely to suicide. And the most affected groups are guys under the age of 34, those with low levels of education, the unemployed and the lonely. And depression in men, especially early on, shows up as irritability and anger. But they're likely misinterpreted as the ways that men are and how they typically show up. Just to say, so to close and maybe to open, is the crisis in masculinity is that we have forgotten the plurality, that being masculinities in the variable plural form, and somehow fixed trait-based behaviours devoid of context and troublingly reminiscent of the problematic 80s have now anchored an unfortunate 5-letter T word in espousing a one-size-fits-all deficit masculinity. To be clear, masculinity in the singular and its T stereotyping is the crisis, and it is because it vilifies the vast majority of Canadian boys and men and entirely misrepresents their poor health outcomes.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next person in the sequence would be Dr. Luc Cousineau to present his opening statement, making the case that there is no crisis.
Looking at the numbers, I feel like you have us at a disadvantage. But I will try to convince you otherwise. To argue that there is a masculinity crisis or a crisis in masculinity, we must first accept 2 things. One is that masculinity is a stand-in which means men. It doesn't. And 2, that the singular term can represent all men, and it cannot. 30 years ago, sociologist R.W. Connell explained that masculinity as a singular thing is impossible because masculinity has always and will always be a changing, moving thing. It is learned, performed, and maintained through culture and power and depends on where, when, and who you are. What it means to be a man here in Kelowna in 2025 is different than what it means in Toronto or Halifax or Iqaluit. It is different for a coal miner or a computer scientist, and all of those things were very different in 1985. This is important because to claim that masculinity is in crisis implies that there is one right way to be a man, and this right way is somehow broken. It erases difference of race, sexuality, social status, geography, and many other things. This so-called crisis is occurring in the face of an opening up of possibility, where men can do and be differently in ways that were not possible under previous regimes of capitalism, patriarchal structures, and stigma. What masculinity, or rather masculinities, are doing today is exactly what we would and should expect, changing with time and the evolution of our social species. We argue that to believe otherwise is to willfully ignore the diverse lives of those lived around you and your own experience. Tonight, you're going to hear arguments that outline the truly troubling health and well-being issues that men are facing, including and especially their mental health. These are truly serious issues that we must address urgently. But I ask you the question of whether these are issues with masculinity or whether they are symptoms of a social problem that leaves the health and well-being of just under 50% of the population lagging. Rather than a masculinity crisis, this is a moral failing in helping men and boys understand masculinity as possibility, not limits. You may also hear arguments today rooted in something called biological determinism, or the idea that your biology, like brain shape, dictates who you can and can't be. For men, this often means predispositions to aggression and dominance. Arguing for biological determinism as the cause to the challenges faced by some men is a complicated way of saying boys will be boys. It's a deeply problematic way of letting men off the hook for things and behaviors that are no longer socially acceptable. We urge you to reject that argument. My partner and I hope to bring you to a place where you see this not as a crisis of masculinity, but as an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move now to Dr. Fang Wan, presenting the case that there is no crisis.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me? Yeah, I just moved here, so if you have people, my colleagues from Faculty of Management, I want to say thank you for being here. It's lovely. Actually, tonight, we had a very nice pre-dinner at a yacht club. And the whole conversation, we have a pre-conversation about the topic. For the first time, I'm very chatty. I have nothing to say. I'm like, holy crap, I'm going to have a speech. Why I feel nothing to say? And then I remember that, I get involved in psychoanalysis, and my psychoanalysts always say, Fang, how do you feel? Why do you feel this way? And I feel I have nothing to say. And I'm like, where is the difficulty come from? Where does it come from? And I realized that it's almost like a Chinese folk dancer coming to a hip-hop room. And this is why the conversation is difficult. And I think because I'm a professor in business and coming from female leadership and all this global landscape, and I really cannot agree with this argument, especially from my own space. So I'm going to share a few thoughts. The first of all is when you think about globally, from Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, even some countries in Europe, and very famous culture theorist, Hofstede, is telling you the countries who are ranked very high in masculinity and power distance, in those societies, men actually, they do dominate the social, political, religious, family, and corporate hierarchy. So there's no crisis. It is a continuity. The second point, very simple, is that when we think about the data, do you know 68% of the students from UBC are women, right? So, woo, women, girl power, right? But this is not a standalone data. When we look at some data showing 5 million kids tracking their performance, the girls and women from grade school to graduate school, they all outperform their male counterparts. That's great, right? Girl power. But one thing we don't understand is that in this corporate world, in this top 500 companies, in the giant tech, the business leaders, from Elon Musk to all these people, the women are very quiet, silent, and also there's constantly, it doesn't matter if it's North America or any other countries, no more than 9% of the leadership positions are for women. So in this case, if masculinity is in crisis, why don't we see it in the boardrooms? The third point is very simple, is that, I try to understand men. Sorry, we're very different species. We're different social animals. We can connect, we can get married, but we're radically different, right? So I tried to dig into psychoanalysis, and this is Freud, and we're saying, manhood by itself is a performance and defense. So I get your vulnerability, because poor boys, they were taught, to repress their vulnerability, to deny dependence, and to mask their tenderness and weakness with a sense of control, right? So so masculinity in crisis, it's not a new crisis. It's an old instability, but just more prominently revealed in today's time. I'm gonna make my last point. My favorite person in the world is this woman named Claudia Golden. She's a professor at Stanford, Nobel laureate. Her work in career and family, she speaks very loudly about, the women education, the workforce participation increased radically, but why these high status and highly paid jobs they call it greedy work, the long hours and all time you need to be available
I'm going to cut
belong
you
to
off.
women.
I'll tell you what, I'll
okay.
ask you a question about
yes.
it later. How about
so
that?
the end point is that jobs belong to men, and women have no space because of that, the demand. Sorry, I'm done.
Thank you, Fang. So we're going to end now with Jonathan Kay, who is arguing that masculinity is in crisis.
Is masculinity in crisis? Of course it's in crisis. Thanks to the world we live in, we're all in crisis. If any of you are not in crisis, you're not paying attention.
That's fair. That's fair.
We could just as easily have had this debate about whether the feminine ideal is in crisis. Many conservative women I know are so confused that they are now inhabiting the 1950s. They dress like characters from Grease or Mad Men or Happy Days, which for those of you who are students was a situation comedy. Among progressives, it's just as bad. They can't define what a woman is. You ask them and they lose their minds. But at least with women, there's a language for talking about this. Are you a third-wave feminist, or a fourth-wave feminist, or an intersectional feminist, or a radical feminist? I actually don't know the difference, but they do. And they talk about it, which is great. There's an established idiom for that discussion. Having the equivalent conversation with men, or masculinity, is more difficult. It's seen as problematic, at least in polite company. People worry that you're going to start talking about men's rights. Or worse, you're going to start quoting from Joe Rogan. Let me put you at ease. I will not quote from Joe Rogan. And I'm not going to kvetch to you about how DEI mandarins and feminists are stealing my awesome, sick manhood. I'm a dude, and I'm doing just fine. But many young men I meet are not doing just fine. Compared to women their age, they have more difficulty in school, they have more difficulty accessing higher education, they have less impulse control, shorter attention spans, they have greater vulnerability to the lures of electronic media. They end up in dead-end jobs, and the resultant status anxiety leads them to dark places. Political radicalism, super weird caveman diets, and creepy podcasts offering terrible dating advice. Now, I'm absolutely not arguing for a return to some imaginary utopia where men were macho and women were delicate, because that has its own problems, as my own personal experience dictates. I'm just old enough to remember the macho era. As a child, I went to an old-fashioned, boys-only English-style school where bullying wasn't exactly encouraged, but it was expected that we boys would work out our social dominance hierarchies in the schoolyard, on the hockey rink, or the rugby pitch. At recess, we played a game called Murder Ball, which, when I have more time later, I'll tell you all about. Like I said, this is not an ideal of masculinity I want to return to. I'm glad that schools now don't tolerate that kind of thing. But the enthusiasm with which we little beasts assailed each other did educate me about some of the unfortunate realities of the evolutionarily programmed male brain. She got like 5 extra minutes. Okay, yeah, okay. I got 3 paragraphs, and they're good. So one thing Murder Ball taught me, like it or not, men are fixated on competition and strength and status hierarchies. There's a reason that adolescent monkeys fight each other. It's so they can create a hierarchy and they don't go to war when they're old. It's part of our evolutionarily conditioned brain. I agree that social construction is part of it, but come on. Evolution, our brain, biology plays a role. Men crave respect, they crave belonging and status. And if they don't see a pathway to that in the real, respectable world, they devolve into milieus where they think that's possible. Worlds like disreputable political extremism, especially violent video games. They become obsessed with UFC. They get into drugs, which supply an altered state, and sometimes they get into crime. This is what I mean when I say masculinity is in crisis.
I didn't time that out, but I think it was equitable.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
Okay, so thank you, everyone, or for all of our debaters for your opening statements. I did have some questions, and so I want to start with kind of a basic one. I want to really bring us back to the absolute basics, and I'm hoping everyone on stage here can help us by first defining, or at least explaining, what do you mean when you say masculinity? Because I'm not sure that I heard any clear definitions from anything today. So maybe, Luke, we can start with you. What do you mean by masculinity?
So I think when I'm thinking about masculinity, I'm thinking about the ways that we, in a social context, really think about how we classify certain groups of people. And the reason that feels vague is that it must be vague. We have tons of research across a wide variety of spaces, especially sociology, but certainly lots of other spaces, that tells us that masculinity, one, isn't solely confined to men and the way that men argue, as part of my opening statement. So you have authors like Jack Halberstrom, who's written about female masculinity. But it gives us a language to talk about certain kinds of behaviors, certain ways of being that we have historically and sometimes contemporarily used to describe men. Most important for me is that masculinity is not a stand-in for men and can't be, because it removes the power of that piece of language.
So I'll go over to this side. Did you broadly agree with that? That it's, to paraphrase very loosely, it's masculinity is more of a construct than anything else.
Yeah, so you make some really good points, Luke. Just to say that, there's this notion of dominant ideals of masculinity, so these hegemonic masculinities in the plural, and it's how guys line up to those things that are kind of interesting, because there's characteristics that we see, certainly in health, that help us think about how we might better promote guys' health or better help them do health better. So there's these opportunities that pivot on things like self-reliance, stoicism and strength. Sometimes that can work really well for self-management, Alternatively, it can be a barrier to help seeking. So it's trying to think about those characteristics. So they're masculine kind of ideals that we see that some guys align to really closely. And that's part of the work that we do. But this idea of this dominant ideal of masculinity, time and again, for the longest time, we've kind of been caught in what is traditional masculinity. And I feel like it's a blowback to the 70s, 80s, where we're talking about those values. And I think what we've got is a brand new generation of blokes growing up that are doing masculinity different. Hence my point, the plurality of masculinity is so important at the moment.
I just want to touch on something, because there's something that sort of bothers me about that idea of it being just a bit of a construct, and that is the universality of the statistics that you mentioned. Very high death rates, very high suicide rates among all demographics. So how, if we are just looking at it just as a construct, maybe to the non-crisis side, if it is just a construct, how do you square that circle? Why is it? Why are men more predisposed to these very serious problems?
Well, I mean, you will see there is some alignment between these two sides, because I think that when we are talking about, you're talking about squaring the circle, and I'm talking about taking a single thing and applying it really broadly. And so if we say, oh, this is about masculinity, and this is why men are having this problem. No, men are having this problem because we have chosen to spend a lot of time talking about different ways to be a woman and almost no time talking about different ways to be a man. We have 30, 35, 40, 50 years of theory that tells us that men exist in this plurality, men exist in a multiplicity. Look around you right now. Are there two men sitting near you that are the same? No. But we talk about masculinity and it's like, oh, masculinity is this big problem and men have this big problem. Well, masculinity and the representation of that is not the same as being a man. But if we're not going to support men over time, if we're not going to provide them the things that they need in order to be healthy and well, then men have a problem and we have a moral failing socially. But masculinity isn't the problem. Masculinity changes over time. It's what it's always done forever. So masculinity isn't the problem. Socially supporting men, that's different. And that's a different discussion altogether.
So, I do want to throw to Fung here, because I wanted to go back to your definition of masculinity, because you talked to us a little while ago about this idea of how masculinity is viewed different in Asia, for example, this idea of warm men. So how do you view the definition or the description of masculinity from your perspective?
I think masculinity very difficult to disentangle from gender, right? So a lot of my arguments were thinking about it's a very male dominance, of course, and that's really, I think, in crisis. But what is very desired is actually, when you think of masculinity, it's actually disentangled from gender. It's becoming a social and a psychological attribute. For example, competence. For example, decisiveness. And so then we're going back to East Asia perspective, because I do a lot of training there, and what is really interesting is rising status and power of professional women. And also there is another phenomenon in East Asia. I don't know how many, East Asian, the Chinese girls are here, and the old traditional family, the parents always rush them to get married. But then when you think about a partner, and actually what is really interesting, that what they want is that we want a warm man. This is exactly the verbatim translation. So what is a warm man? It's actually, I don't think it's an opposite of masculinity, but definitely there is a compassion, a lot of respect, shared, collaboration, I think empathy. And these are emotionally important attributes, EQ. Looks like it is very desired of the women who want to get married to this kind of partners. So I want to add another layer, is that maybe we need to add these other femininity attributes to the mix to make it a well-rounded man.
Okay. Jonathan.
So I think we all agree that there's a huge socially constructed element of masculinity. And if you're a student of history, you could go back and read about the ancient Greeks, who homoeroticism, as we would now use that term, was part of ancient Greek military culture. So throughout the ages, the idea of what makes a man obviously has a socially constructed apart. What hasn't changed are the biologically rooted evolutionary psychology elements that are just different between men and women. And I think it's impossible to have this conversation without acknowledging that that exists. This is something I happen to be the father of 3 daughters. So I've observed it anecdotally, and it very much aligns with some of the differences that you see in the literature and some of the differences that have been observed clinically. And the fabric of modern society, and this isn't like a feminist plot or anything like that, but the fabric of modern society rewards more collaborative behavior, more collaborative professional behavior. I see the way my daughters excel in school, often in settings that are very alien from what my settings were like at university, where there's a lot of group projects. Planning your career starts much early. Like in the discussion we had before, you have people who are 13 or 14 starting to plan their career. You have greater impulse control, you have greater forward planning. Girls mature faster than men. And also just we live in a society where aggression and acute competitiveness are more stigmatized than they used to be. I screwed up in all sorts of ways when I was younger, and there really was a boys would be boys mentality. The idea was, well, you know, he's kind of smart, he'll probably get his act together in his 20s and stumble into college and eventually find a respectable career. Instead, I went into journalism. But that kind of world where people will just wait till you mature into your 20s doesn't exist anymore, because if you screw up when you're 17, it's on YouTube and it follows you around for the rest of your life. And because boys' brains mature slower, they have more difficult, and I've just observed this with kids, they just have more difficulty observing the more complex emotional and intellectual requirements of online life. Girls just do it better than boys. And so a lot of this goes to the biologically rooted nature of the difference between men and women. I think it's great to talk about the culturally rooted difference, and because that is malleable. You know, I went to a boys' school, and so I was able to kind of do like a controlled intellectual experiment of what do these little beasts, how do they operate in this Lord of the Flies environment without the civilizing influence of women? And it's horrifying. You know, I mean, it's one of the reasons I send all 3 of my girls to co-ed schools, is to help the boys. No, and this is serious pedagogical advice. I do think there's, I'm not sure if this has been studied, I think there's more value to boys of going to a co-ed school than there is for girls. And that certainly would have been true of me. God knows what would have happened to my life if that had happened, but it's something to think about, not just as a debater, but also as a parent.
I think I'm going to throw to you, Luke, because I think you did talk about this in your opening statement. Do you agree with the idea that there is a fundamental biological underpinning of how we define masculinity?
How we define masculinity? Is that that's the question?
Yeah.
Is there a fundamental biological underpinning to how we define masculinity? No. Because I think, as my partner has demonstrated, as if we polled the audience, they would demonstrate, if there's 4 white men sitting on this stage, if we talked about what the representations of masculinity that we had growing up, they would be wildly different. And so, in context, in relative, yeah, if we had a more sort of diverse set of panelists up here, then perhaps they would be even more so different. My argument is that the definitions of masculinity that we have are constructed by the social environments in which we come up. And so the definition of masculinity that I'm gonna have as a kid who grew up in Southern Ontario is gonna be really different than perhaps Feng had, or siblings of hers, cousins, etc., growing up in China. And so I think that, are those things, is there a fundamental sort of biological underpinning to the definition of masculinity? No. Am I arguing that like men and women, boys and girls aren't different? No, certainly I'm not, because they are. They demonstrably are. But we are, I think, too easily conflating how we decide who and what men are through masculinity with the fact of sort of being biologically a boy or a man. And that's a really, like, it's a really complex and nuanced argument, right? But it is essential to the way in sort of the evolved social society that we have, regardless of how you think about the way we are doing that currently, whether you think things are too woke or not woke enough or whatever, if we conflate those things, if we equate them, if we decide they're the same, then we are certainly lost in our quest to create a world where the most people can live in the best way we all can.
Thank you. I do want to maybe shift gears here a little bit. And Fung, I'm going to ask you a question. You made an argument when we were talking about this earlier, about this idea of young men being liberated from the traditional, let's say, trappings of earlier definitions of masculinity. I'm hoping you can expand on that a little.
Because and my debate partner, Luke, lives in Ontario, right? So we talk about Vancouver, we talk about Shanghai, we talk about Beijing, we talk about in the modern cosmopolitan society, the rising cost of living. So what is really interesting is that people talk about the parents, and John has 3 daughters. I have a son who's a hockey player. So talking about masculinity, that is really the world he lives in. What shocks me is what he said. He said, we're talking about the future wife and what kind of woman you want to be with. And he totally shocked me by saying, I want someone strong, assertive, and can do things even better than me because the 2 warriors can uphold the sky. And I love that analogy. Right? So why it has to be a one single breadwinner and who is a man, and there is a wife at home, and this kind of model is outdated. So the whole idea of this masculinity crisis is about we need to be adaptive. We need to really adjust to this changing ideals. And going back to this whole, I didn't finish the Claudia Golden, I love her, it's really talking about this high-paid, high demand, especially the hours. My husband is a leader. I understand there is no time that is downtime. So for the caregiver, especially most of the responsibility is for women, there is no space for that, right? So that's why she coined the word called greedy job. The greedy job, a high status, high paying job, there is very little space for women. So this is why, and I think the 2 warriors, and so let's not define by gender, let's define by whoever is suitable to do what, and I'm still talking about in a more family context. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, so. The 2 warriors analogy is an interesting one, and I want to look over to John maybe, and do you think men and young men who are struggling, why aren't they taking up that mantle? Why aren't they embracing this idea that they can define themselves?
Yeah, so the structural determinants of health kind of get off pretty easy, the things that dictate the norms. We interviewed 115 guys across 15 countries about what they thought an equitable gender relationship would be, with a partner. And the thing that popped most often was about being a protector, a provider, and a breadwinner. Now, they're old school values, and every one of those guys, they were between 19 and 44, they were really battling to quite realise their vision because their milestones are later than their dads and their grandfathers. They might not ever own a house, they might not, finish school till they're 35. There's a whole bunch of things that are lagging behind. So, it's all well and good to go, well, yeah, absolutely, let's redefine it and do it on our own terms. That would be lovely. But there's structural pieces in place that are still very, very persuasive and still there that guys are interacting with, and they're battling with that. And that is part of the crisis.
So is there... But if it is working in some cultures, as Fung is suggesting, why can't we learn from that and apply some of those lessons here?
Sure, so they're big questions, obviously big questions in terms of structure, but, the things that give us routine and purpose are the structures that we live within. So social determinants of health, I often say Canada actually, we invented it. Social determinants. So we're very, very key to the things that disadvantage people and disparities and addressing those. So, those structural pieces that we interact with are really key. So it's really tough to operate outside of them. The things that disadvantage us. inflation, the cost of things, tax on tax, those sorts of things, they disadvantage, and they're the systems that you interact with. And so it's very tough in terms of guys reinventing themselves where a system is taxing them 54 cents on the dollar if they ever get up to that level. Those points that make it difficult to sort of to achieve what might have been achieved in previous generations when things were affordable, where you only had to work hard, and work long and be loyal, and you'd probably own your house and you own your car. They're not available to young men these days.
Right. That's a good point. I think the international comparisons only take us so far because there are certain universal phenomena you observe. In things like entertainment culture, military culture, and sports culture, the veneration of alpha males, the desire of males to be alpha males, and the veneration of alpha males by both women and men is a constant you see in military cultures, sports cultures, celebrity film cultures, action movies, all around the world. And now that we have greater exposure to international cultures, Bollywood, the film industry in China, Latin America, Africa, those constants are more on display than they might have been a generation ago. So it's absolutely true. Of course there are cultural differences in the way masculinity expresses itself. But it's wrong to say, well, there's no universals. Masculinity is kind of whatever socially constructed the crowdsourcing does. A lot of it comes to the, cult leaders around the world tend to be men because there's a will to power that arguably, I say is evolutionarily programmed, that can express itself sociopathically or in a benign way, but it is preferentially expressed by men. And this is not something that alternates between cultures. And again, unless we come to terms with that, I think you kind of dead end by saying, well, it's just a big cultural free-for-all, because of course it'd be nice to think it was a cultural free-for-all. Then you could just sort of program to people to accept anything. But the reason there's such a tension is because men do crave status. There is something in our conditioning that, not saying it can't be, you can't work on it. I think if you look at the way, for instance, sports culture works, it was once expected that male athletes would conduct themselves with women in a certain way. And it says, well, they're a star, they can act in this way. We've changed that. If you look at hockey culture, there are certain things that are just not okay now, which is great. I remember when professional athletes got away with a lot of stuff that they don't get away with now. You people,
hold on.
I'll take you back to the 70s and 80s, I'll drop some names on you. They still get away with too much, but things have changed. Political leaders just get away with a lot less. So you can change the norms, but I don't think you can change the instincts. Those are root.
So, to say that we are not in a position today with the media and technology infrastructures and influence infrastructures that we have right now, to say that we can't take people and program them in almost whatever way we want, I think is a preposterous statement. Of course we can.
You think we're like software?
We see it every day.
But human beings
we see it every day. We socially program young men to commit violent acts. It happens all the time. I can bring you reams of research that demonstrate this. And is this because of a predisposition to violence? If it was because of a predisposition to violence, statistically in this room, we would have somebody who was thinking of or acting on committing mass violence statistically if we agree that men are predisposed to violence because of the content that people under 30 in this room are consuming all the time that is fed to them at all times. And so I don't agree that we are not in a position where we can sort of change behavior, that we are predisposed to behave in a certain way.
So you're arguing against a point no one has made. Every society takes measures to control the will to violence. If they didn't, they wouldn't be societies. They would be Hobbesian dystopias. What I'm saying is that there are limits on our ability to do that effectively. And to do it more effectively, which is presumably a goal we share, you have to be mindful of the underlying instincts and not pretend them away as if they were social constructs.
So I do want to go back to this idea of liberation, because I think it's an interesting one. And you know, the other side of that coin potentially could be, you know, this idea of, you know, that liberation might work for warm men that are able to embrace it, but there's lots of men that probably can't. And so does that liberation also mean potentially abandonment for some men that aren't able to adapt? Luke, maybe I'll ask you that question.
I think the original word of liberation is that, you know, instead of being, you have to be doing one thing, the breadwinner, the only person in the family, and actually you're liberated, your burden is shared, you know, by someone else. So I think that the whole premises of the whole masculinity and all that is really, I really don't buy it in a way that it's a singular. There's a one way, right? So the argument is like one way during crisis because that privileged way, that dominance way, that, you know, and I really think that there are different models. And you're right, the alpha male and all these media portrayal and also social media content, they're not promoting alternative masculinity, and which is out there. You know, so this is, I think it's also the source, the algorithm of the content as well. That when we see, you know, why Andrew Tate is so popular. I mean, I did research for this one. I didn't know, and I was shocked by his content. And then I did research, and I asked Google, I asked ChatGPT, why he has so many millions of followers, why? And going back to John's point is that the boys, you know, they don't have good role model, and this guy is rampantly out there. His content toxic out there. So I think that's one of the issues as well, is that what is the genetic code? I mean, genetic in terms of content. What is the structural optimum way of, you know, what is the different models of masculinity need to be out there in the social media and monitored by the algorithm. There should be alpha male algorithm, but there should be more balanced masculinity algorithm as well.
Luke, do you want to jump in?
The question, I think, is what do we do for the people that can't keep up, that can't do the adaptation? Because we're talking about something that changes over time, I mean, these things don't change instantly. If there are people that are sort of left behind in that it's not on them. And I think this is where John Kay and I agree, is that if this is something sort of ingrained in them, whether we believe that it is wholly or mostly socially constructed as I do or otherwise, it is incumbent on sort of the rest of us, the social setting that's saying we are moving in this direction, and if you can't keep up, you can't come along with us. We need to work with them to have them come along with us so that behaviors that we don't find acceptable remain non-acceptable, and we say, no, not here, not now. And so I think in this point, John and I actually agree that, yeah, there are behaviors that were acceptable that are not now, and we've brought people along, and people we haven't been brought along have been perhaps not as frequently or as severely as we would like, been held to account for their actions in this changing environment. And so we need to continue to do that. We need to hold people, especially men who hold power, and particularly men that are older who hold power, hold them account to their behavior under changing norms. And this is a really important piece of, well, what happens for those people that can't keep up? Well, we have to bring them along.
Is there not an argument then that says, well, the best way to get them the supports they need is to recognize this is a crisis?
No, because that's not a crisis of masculinity. It's these guys being jerks. It's these guys not being able to look at the status of the world and go, I can't do sexual assault anymore. I need to learn what consent is. And to argue that they can't do that is preposterous.
So,
you can
John.
say that. Great.
No, I'm not going to ask you to defend sexual assault. But is it fair to label this as a crisis when it's affecting a very specific subset of men that are struggling to adapt? Or should, is there a question of more personal responsibility? And does even labeling it as a crisis maybe create more stigma and exacerbate the problem even?
Well, I don't want to play to the room, but 60% of you know that there's a crisis, and we're just helping you understand it. We're talking about masculinity like it's something like that's out there that you grab hold of and it's in the sphere somewhere. But it's constructed, it's co-constructed. We do it in our everyday, in our relations. A neoliberal world where we're selling produce and a third of the deaths you can attribute to alcohol, tobacco, fossil fuels. There's a whole bunch of things going on there that guys are interacting with. And, across alcohol, tobacco, they're higher consumption in males. If you want to talk about online gambling, 78% of the apps are owned by guys. Most of them have got 2 or 3 apps going on. We approved, gambling, multi-game gambling during COVID when no one had anything else to do. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on that is a crisis. And some of them are structural, some of them are co-constructed, and it's not like just grabbing something that's out there in the atmosphere. They're in the everyday, and relationally, we all have an obligation to address this crisis.
Yeah, good.
So I'm wondering how many people in the audience are familiar with the term horseshoe theory? This idea that when you go to the extreme left or the extreme right, you kind of come to the same point on certain topics. And the interesting thing about masculinity is, I think a lot of people would say, well, the people banging on about masculinity the most are like these sort of right-wing culture warriors, and they do podcasts about UFC fighting and all this stuff. I only started hearing about masculinity in the media when Justin Trudeau was banging on about toxic masculinity in all his speeches and stuff like that. And it was progressives and the left who were talking about this monolith called masculinity. I didn't wake up in the morning thinking about, well, what would be the masculine thing to do now? And then Trudeau started banging on about how masculinity is toxic, and one of the reasons he provoked resentment with that stuff was it was like, well, easy for you to say, you're at the top of the heap. A lot harder when you're an Uber driver. If you're... I always pause for applause. But it's, and this is actually one of the things, messaging, I'm not sure how much of the substance, Luke and I disagree on, but some of the messaging can be so exasperating when you have corporate leaders, men, politicians, men, who are like, let's take a moment to reflect on toxic masculinity. Before I get into my sick car and go to my third cottage, let's talk about how men are garbage, right? Because that's important. And it's the sheer hypocrisy of that. And a lot of this is age. You've got, it's like the okay boomer thing. It's like, guys like me, I'm kind of doing okay. And then I see younger guys have it tough. And if you talk to them, they really resent when successful men talk down to them and tell them that it's toxic, that everything they're doing is toxic, and, some horrible dude did something and you have to apologize for that other guy's toxic masculinity. And it's like, really? That's what I got to do? And some of the DEI, I don't want to turn this into a culture war thing about DEI. Everyone's sick about talking about DEI. However, the thing about DEI is people hate it, and men especially, when it's like, look, the university nursing program is 90% female. The teachers' college is 90% female, but they have a gender equity program to advantage women. They're like, it doesn't necessarily bother them that these professions are mostly female. What kind of bothers them is that it's mostly female, and then they're still being further disadvantaged by these programs. They're like, really? You're putting your finger on the scale when the scale is already all the way down on that side? And I think, again, I don't want to personalize this to Trudeau, but there was late 2010s, it really exacerbated, I think, the sense of umbrage that a lot of men had when they're saying things are already bad for us, and the elite class, political class, journalistic class, every time they turn on the news or they look at social media, they're being asked to apologize for their toxic masculinity. And often by men who have it good and are virtue signaling, I'll use that term, by kicking down on men who are lower socioeconomic status as a way to bolster their own social justice bona fides. And they resent that, and they're right to resent that. That's my opinion.
I'm going to touch on, or I want to come back to something very specific you said about nursing, and there are lots of fields certainly that are there are more women
Which is
represented.
fine, because women are different than men, and they nurture people.
Well, but men also have agency.
Yeah, I said it. I said it. Deal with it.
Hey,
deal with it.
Guys, tone it down.
Excuse me?
Yes.
Deal with it? You just tell the
Tone it
audience
down.
to deal with it?
Yeah, I'm telling you to deal with it.
That
because I'm a man.
idea is you
I
are
talk like
dating
that.
yourself in a way
Okay.
that
And I'm
is
manspreading. Hold on.
obtuse, man.
Hold on. Let's keep it
That
civil.
presupposes that men cannot
Give
be
me a mic to
nurturing,
drop.
though, John.
Luke,
Which is
Guys, Luke,
Did you hear what he said?
let's keep it civil.
Civil.
Guys, keep it civil, seriously.
Did you hear what he said?
Keep it civil.
It was very abusive.
Let's relax.
It was toxic.
I actually have a really good question to ask. And that is
feel
about
unsafe.
some of these programs where men are underrepresented, because men have agency in deciding what opportunities they pursue. Why aren't they? Why aren't they choosing some of these? Like nursing is a great example. You can graduate, get a job immediately, have a great career.
Yep.
Men aren't choosing them. Why?
how long do you have?
Not much longer.
Not much longer. Okay. I mean, what we're talking about now is not sort of antithetical to STEM, but it sort of exists beside STEM, right? Which we might call HEAL professions, health, education. And these historically code female. And they code female for a variety of reasons. And there are some deep sociological reasons why we look at perhaps elementary education as a women's profession, but more advanced education not, until very recently, and even then still. And the core argument of that is, of course, that these are nurturing spaces where women are better attuned, except would you not argue that doctors should also be nurturing? Because doctors have heavily coded over time as male, but why?
I think women can be doctors.
Yes, and I would imagine that you think men can be teachers. So the argument about those things being coded female is because women are nurturing, then doesn't hold.
Medical schools are mostly female now, you know that, right?
Yeah, because over time we have pushed in that direction. We have made strides in that way. But if the argument is about nurturing, then you are also saying on the flip side of that, that jobs that aren't nurturing, like STEM, are not properly coded for women. You're making this here that upholds this binary gender idea of who can do what jobs, which we have demonstrated here, backstage, everywhere, which doesn't really hold. And so I think that if we're talking about HEAL professions, I actually would be a great advocate for programs to put in place to encourage more men to move into these spaces.
Yes.
Why don't we do that?
Yes.
They are not compensated at the same level, except for doctors. Doctors are an exclusion, but they're not compensated at the same level as STEM. They're not compensated in the same way. And I feel John has something.
Yeah, I just wanted to share. It would be remiss of me not to say something at this point. So it's 20 years as an RN. I want you to know I care. And that might be my crisis in masculinity, according to these people. Anyway, I just wanted you to know a little bit of lived experience. I know I'm an N of one, but hell, I care, and I'm okay with it. And I might have even been kind when I was on the floor most days. But just to say, we are well compensated, finally, and we do a good job. Finally, we're not acknowledged, and I think COVID brought that to the fore. I just want to shout it out, you know? Yeah.
I think we can all agree that there are lots of different drivers for the challenges that are facing men. In fact, I think we all agree that there are challenges facing men and boys. We've talked a lot about economic challenges, mental health and isolation, educational gaps. That's one of the arguments that you've made. And social media and influencers, we've talked a little bit about that. It is something we've touched on, but I actually wouldn't mind delving into that just a little bit more, actually. And I mean, there is some pretty questionable, to put it lightly, content on social media. But why are men particularly vulnerable to this kind of content? If masculinity is adaptable, as Luke, you've pointed out, why are boys as young as 9, parroting Andrew Tate, for example? Like, what's going on? Why are they being drawn to that kind of content?
So, you're playing to my academic nuance here, which is difficult to do in a short period of time. So I think when we say that masculinity is adaptable and we are moving in a space where we need to be more adaptable in that way, adaptation can take a long time. Change can take a long time. And if we haven't been supporting change in the way that we need to, and I think this is a lot of what my colleagues on the other side are talking about, is that men are left, young men in particular, are left wondering, well, how do I do this? How do I become a man? And if the only option they have put in front of them is from, for example, social media influencers, and those voices, the amplified voices in that space, let's be clear, the social media companies that we consume content from are private companies that are designed to and beholden to make money for shareholders, and therefore they support content that is funded in a certain way and provides certain ideas because that's what makes money, whether it's love clicks or rage clicks. Those companies push people in a certain direction. And so there are really good infrastructural, and I know infrastructure is super boring until we're talking about the internet and why you get to see all the things that you see in your feed, that pushes us in this direction, and particularly pushes young men in this direction. And I think that's a really important thing we do not talk about enough.
Fung, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I really think the audience is very smart, because I really think that there's a reason that Australia will ban social media for the kids who are younger. And all the research from Yale professor compiled all the research that the social media is having negative impact on the mental health, well-being, and also polarize the political views. And there's nothing good about it. And also, I know tonight is about masculinity, but how can women not be part of the picture? So when you think about men are very vulnerable to this polarizing, ultra-violent kind of, all these content, very extreme. Women are not susceptible from, the negative social media is about appearance, anxiety, especially the well-being, the appearance anxiety. And so I think this is one of the things that we need to think about. And the reason is social media is built to, it's called attention economy, is if it's not sensational, if it's not polarizing, you wouldn't get so much likes and engagement. So there is this should be grassroots, something that we need to do to censor these content, but that's just not in place. And I really personally think that that's a problem. So it's not uniquely men, it is all the young people and us are susceptible to the social media influence.
So
they're not monitored, they're not regulated, they know more about AI and the algorithm than the regulator. That's a problem.
So I want to go back to something you said, Luke, around this idea that boys and young men are turning towards the internet because they may not have the spaces or the role models, and so they turn there maybe out of desperation. I know you didn't use that word, but John, I want to throw to you, because is that true? I know you've worked to create spaces where they can find those role models and men can exist in a more constructive space. So what's going on here?
I agree that the crisis is around social media. So that's one of the crises of masculinity. Any idiot with a view can have that view broadcast out like it's fact, and it does influence. If you think about guys, they're formulating their identity up until 25. I mean, they're malleable, and so they're getting these feeds, and it's norming things, which is really unhelpful. We've done work with peers, about how peer support might help guys and how we would connect better, to do health better, to address some of the shortfalls in terms of mental health care. And again, that's really interesting, because most guys are brought up to kind of tease each other and connect in ways that are more about one-upmanship, and friendly competitive, if you like, and sometimes not. And, so trying to sort of get them into a space of being able to have the deeper conversations has been a challenge, because we don't, typically, show how to do that. We're not necessarily brought up to do that either. And so, there's lots of ongoing work in that space. You're certainly not going to get too many examples of that on your feed with social media, in my experience.
Yeah, Jonathan.
I'd like to address that, but if I could just pause to recognize this beautiful bridging point between me and Luke, where both of us, it's like a romantic comedy where we're fighting, but it turns out that actually we both support the idea of bringing more men into the so-called caring professions, right? So I think it's cool that we both support the Luke and John affirmative action program.
It is beautiful.
For dudes, dude power. So, but I mean, maybe not with those words, but I would love to see more men, elementary school teachers and nurses and stuff like that. I mean, it's kind of like that movie Meet the Parents. Ben Stiller's character was a nurse, and it was played as a joke because his romantic rival was a doctor, and that was very toxic. However, I just want to talk about the mental health component because it's huge, and I think our audience is smart when they zeroed in on it, because this I have absolutely seen. We live in an era of plenty when you can order anything on Amazon, and people get all sorts of stuff, but there's two things that they're not making more of: real estate and status. And when you're over 30, you focus on real estate, but when you're younger, you focus on status. And I see this with kids. When I was a kid, there was a status hierarchy at our school. The coolest kid in the class was Bobby Lenny. He was great at football, and he had a girlfriend, and he was the whole package. And when you went home for the weekend or you went to summer camp, you could forget about that hierarchy. There was a vacation from it. When I see kids now, because of social media, there's no vacation from the status hierarchy. You're comparing yourself to kids all over the world, and you're comparing yourself to kids in the class. You're counting the number of likes, you're counting the number of retweets or re-WhatsApps or, whatever they're using. It's all quantified. So as long as you know the number line from grade 1, you can count how popular you are based on the number of little heart emojis. And there's no vacation from it. It happens on the weekend, it happens when you go to summer camp, it happens at night, you're on vacation in Costa Rica with your family, you're counting likes. There's no vacation from the status war, and it causes anxiety. But the anxiety expresses itself differently. I see that with girls and women, they're more likely to take mental health supports, either in school or from health providers. To some extent, we were talking about this in the pre-event, to some extent, they identify tribally with the anxieties they experience. They say, I have ADHD or I have anxiety, and I've reached out to others, and I'm part of a Facebook group of other people who suffer from this. And it kind of builds strength and even a sense of identity. Men and boys, it's the opposite. They retreat. They retreat into video games, or they retreat into silence. And I actually don't pretend to know why that's the case. I'm guessing there's an evolutionary vector, because that's my thing. But it is absolutely the case that the audience is correct. Isolation, social media, status anxiety. Underlying all this stuff with masculinity, status anxiety. If you feel you can't get married, you feel you can't be a provider, you feel like that word salad, you feel like you can't embody all of those terms that the audience put up an hour ago, you have status anxiety, and you're prey to anyone who promises to restore that anxiety. Whether it's a right-wing influencer or a left-wing influencer, a cult leader, someone who tells you have to eat 17 steaks a day and you're gonna be all muscle-bound. We've all seen ads for these podcasts. Some of us have listened to them. But to me, that's the root of the problem.
So Luke, I want to ask you something, because we've spoken about this before, this idea that this crisis or this idea of masculinity changing is not a new idea. In the early 1900s, the Boy Scouts was created because there was this crisis in masculinity at the time. But isn't it different now? Doesn't social media change the dynamic in ways that we've never seen before?
Change the dynamic around?
Well, maybe the crisis, or is the situation more acute than what we've seen in the past with changes in masculinity because of social media?
Do I think that the push to change is more acute now than then? No, but I think that the pushback to the social change that comes with time is framed in a way on social media that is wildly different than we could have done before. And so there has always been pushback, as there always is when there's change. There has always been pushback to that change. The difference is, and I think John said this really eloquently, like, any fool with an opinion can now broadcast that opinion globally. And while sometimes that can be really efficient for starting conversation, it can be really problematic in amplifying pushback against social change. And if we can identify that a social change sort of away from sort of sexual violence, for example, is a net social good, but then part of the, for example, the misogynistic manosphere influence sphere is going to tell you that actually misogyny and sexual violence towards your partner is fine and right and actually the thing you should be doing. Well, we would have never platformed that previously in a time of social change moving away from that. And now, not only is it platformed, but it is fed directly into the eyeballs and the ear holes of the young people who are most influenced by that kind of content. And I think that that's the real difference here. That's the amplifying factor of social media and the digital technology landscape that we have today, which makes it so much more dangerous than the pushback has ever been in the past.
So then, John, is there maybe a bit of a risk if we are calling this a crisis? Does it not then amplify some of those problematic voices even more?
I think we're agreeing. I think we're agreeing that there's the crisis, and part of it is in and around the social media, and it's unregulated, you know. So I think we've got some agreement there that, you know, there's a crisis in and of itself right there. And to John's point, you know, that the village used to be pretty small when the boomers were growing up. It was your town, it was your high school, and it's just not like that anymore. And just, you know, they're kind of captive. And followed, almost stalked and fed, you know, things. And I often wonder about some of the podcasts that we talk about all the time with Rogan and Etel. And look, I'm not sure how much of it influences guys. I think they're increasingly, I felt like young men especially want to have a conversation about masculinity, and a lot of times it's not safe. And I'd just share one example. We did a talk for buildings and grounds guys that actually at UBC in Vancouver a couple of weeks back. It was just for guys, and it was around men's health and masculinity. And one of the guys came up to me afterwards and said, "I'd love to support what you're doing, but I don't feel safe to do it. I can't get the conversation about masculinity, and I would be seen as somehow, you know, that guy who's involved." So it's kind of polarizing, you know, where we're at, you know. So I just think I think that's part of the crisis as well. We can't get the conversation like this. Like, this is actually pretty good, you know, for opening up and getting some different opinions, but having the conversation. Yeah.
I agree. We'll jump in, yeah.
Because I do a lot of work on social media and especially the impact of algorithms. So what happened is that, as Luke was saying, is that it's an echo chamber effect, because if we see similar content, we likes, and we're fed with a similar content, over time we become more extreme. And the impact of that is that we're less tolerant of the opposite or a different opinion. So I think the crisis, I mean, we talk about masculinity, talk about the threat, talk about the problem is, it's not new, but the perception of a crisis is that the fear of uncertainty and the lack of tolerance of different opinion, and the perceptual crisis, I think, is more prominent today than in the past.
Good. Thank you. So I'm glad that we found some common ground to land on. It's sometimes by having disagreement is when we can find that common ground. So I'm grateful to everyone for sharing their views. We are actually at time, believe it or not. I had so many other questions, but this got feisty and I didn't get to ask all of them. I did want to maybe just give a little bit of time to all of our debaters. If you wanted to make sort of a final point, maybe a pitch for where people might find you or learn about your work or your research, I think now would be the time. So why don't I start with Feng, with you?
Okay, so I started my tonight by saying I feel like it's hard to chime in. And I really think that maybe we should debate on is female leadership in crisis. Because, I mean, and that's really my sector. And I was talking about, perfectionism, rumination, cannot take risk, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. But tonight is for men, is about masculinity in crisis. And as we and a partner talk about is that there are different models of masculinity. Maybe one type, that the dominance and whatever we talked about earlier is in crisis. So what I want to say is that maybe the world ongoing is that we need to, we need the system redesign the system that actually do not confine accessibility and growth and actually invite collaboration and the shared access. And I advocate for women's power as well, is because we do know in the leadership space, it is a very narrow space for women. That's why it's really hard for me to get involved in this debate. I hope I did an okay job. Thank you.
Jonathan, over to you.
I'm just going to finish by shamelessly sucking up to the organizers. To be fair, I said this in the pre-event. I think it's fantastic you're holding these events. I didn't even realize you were doing this. I was saying, I live in Toronto, we have this stereotype, everyone in BC is kind of has a certain kind of political view and dissent is not tolerated. And then I come out here and at the pre-event, I was like, whoa, these people they have all kinds of views. And I was super impressed. You're breaking all kinds of stereotypes, and I made some unflattering comparisons with the political culture at UBC in Vancouver, which I won't repeat. But whatever you're doing here, keep on doing it. I talk trash about Canadian academia a lot on social media. I'm going to have to rethink that. This is real good stuff. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that ringing endorsement. I appreciate it. Maybe Luke, over to you.
I'm going to stand up. I want to start by saying that I have a tremendous respect for the other folks on this stage. And while there are certain things that we in particular might not agree about, I think we have more agreement up here than we have disagreement. So are there crises at play here? Yes, absolutely. There are crises at play. The source of those crises we perhaps disagree on, but certainly there are things that we must urgently think about and urgently act on. I think to be a man means a lot of different things, and how we think about masculinity must then also mean a lot of different things. And if all of those things are in crisis, are we ever in a lot of trouble? I think that there are, in this audience and on this stage, many different ways of articulating masculinity, what it means to us, what it means in society. And if we don't spend time understanding and leaning into that, then we're never going to get anywhere in solving the other crises that we have been talking about here today. That's not a crisis of masculinity. That's a crisis in how we think about masculinity. If masculinity is in crisis, it is a crisis of adaptability and nothing else. If we are meant to be protectors, as you've said in your answers, who are we protecting from? How are we doing that, and why? If we are talking about providing, are we in a place where young people, young men, can be a provider, singular? because I would argue that the systems that we live under have created a space where we cannot be a provider. Households require providers. They require breadwinners. They require plural. And so the idea that an idea that the measure of masculinity is to be the provider is so far outdated that we have lost the thread. So is there a crisis in masculinity? No. There's perhaps a crisis in understanding what that means. There's perhaps a crisis in applying what men and masculinity do in the world and how they are in the world, but that's not a crisis of masculinity. That's us just not keeping up. So I would urge you to think about your answer to, is there a crisis in masculinity? Perhaps you still think there is, and that's fine. Because as John has highlighted, the plurality that is allowed in conversations like this is essential for us to get to a place where we are going to make better decisions socially, and that's what I want. I want us to build a better place where more people can live the best lives they can. And we do it through conversations like this, and we do it by moving forward. And I want to talk to none of the above guy after. Thank you very much.
John, final word goes to you.
It is so good to get the final word on this one. And I got 148 words, and here we go. 40 years on from the Ottawa Charter, health promotion is the tapestry of Canada. But the world is different. It has changed. It's not the same as it ever was. It's a divisive age characterised by self and unregulated social media-driven stigmas. The language can be confusing, where we get Sandy in search of Skookum looking for slap low-key. You'll need a Gen Z to explain that one to you. My point here is that we cannot simultaneously espouse our commitment to equity, diversity and inclusion with a singular deficit-driven masculinity in 2025. Let me finish on a quick uptick, non-mansplaining moment about the blokes in your life. Never ever use the T word again, but instead employ ALEC. A, ask, L, listen, prompt E, elaboration, and always C, check back in. Delete T, employ ALEC as a means to not perpetuating the more than a decade-long crisis that has been the misrepresentation of masculinity in the singular T-hyphenated deficit form.
I want to say in closing, it's been really terrific to share the stage in this evening with all of our debaters. So thank you very much for joining us here and offering your perspectives on this important conversation. This is the 6th debate in our signature series, and we hope you'll continue in this journey with UBCO and join us for upcoming debates. And we encourage you to continue the conversation. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.